So there's kind of a common thread to our show this week. After the massive party in Marseille on Wednesday to welcome the arrival of the Olympic flame, time to turn our gaze north for what's also billed as another It's a Small World After All feel-good celebration. Come in, Malmö, host of the 2024 Eurovision Song Contest, that heart-shaped ode to kitsch, where pop contestants do battle with tremolos, glitter, and kicks. But just as politics bleeds into sports, as we discovered, it also bleeds into music. Security tight around the venue in southern Sweden amid calls by some to bar Israel's contestant. While the ban on Russia after its invasion 2 years ago was for the most part consensual, this call is tearing apart aficionados. By the way, it's not just when the voting's by country. When do rock anthems become national anthems? Just how important is music for propaganda and resistance? And are today's artists any more or less voices for activism than their predecessors? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the politics surrounding this year's Eurovision Song Contest. And joining us from Malmö, Charlie Sona, he's host of the Mysteries of the Euroverse podcast. Thanks for being with us. We're also joined by historian Dean Vuletic, author of Post-War Europe and the Eurovision Song Contest. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good evening from Malmö.
From Helsinki, researcher Zoe J., your current project, The Eurovisionaries, researching how Eurovision fans think about cultural diplomacy. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
France 24 Brussels correspondent Dave Keating reports on the EU and NATO with trademark impartialities. Will viewers still feel that way when this hour is over? How are you doing, Dave?
I'm ready to be as impartial as ever.
Okay. Your reactions on the hashtag F24debate. If you're unfamiliar with the concept, let's take you to the semifinals and offer, well, we could call it an amuse-bouche of what the Eurovision Song Contest is all about. Dave Keating, what's with the shorts there for the contestant from Finland?
Well, I mean, that's one of the quirkier entries this year. Every year you have a couple of really oddball entries. Finland is pretty reliable about providing them. They're the types of entries that do well in particular markets, particularly the UK. UK audiences really like entries like Finland's this year. It's a pretty mixed bag this year, actually. We have a lot of different styles of music, and it's not at all clear who's going to win this year. Actually, it's pretty up in the air.
So, Charlie Sona, let me ask you, how do you know I mean, I see, for instance, that this year there's... Can you hear us okay? You seem to be struggling there with the headpiece. All right, we'll try to cross back to Charlie in a moment. I'll put the question to you, Dean Vuletic. How do you know who's the favorite when there's a Eurovision Song Contest?
Well, everyone relies on the bookies, basically. But you can also predict the favorites, I think, according to the sort of themes that their entries are dealing with. So this year, we see that songs that engage with political and social themes are especially popular in terms of their viewership on platforms such as YouTube, or how many people are listening to them on Spotify.
So that's interesting. So it's not always the case.
It's not always the case, and there aren't always a lot of songs that do engage with political and social issues. This year, with my analysis of the entries, I would say about a third of the songs do. And I think it's very interesting that those songs are the ones that seem to be the most highly favored, especially as the organizers of Eurovision like to insist that this is a non-political event.
A non-political event, and we'll delve into the politics of the non-political event in a moment. Zoe J., What is Eurovision all about? Please explain it for our viewers who don't live in Europe.
Well, it means a lot of things to different people. The basic premise of it is that the countries of Europe and some countries from outside of geographical Europe, including Australia and controversially Israel, participate in quest for the best song. But that historical attachment that people feel to the contest, it's a source of different genres of music every year. It's a chance to get to know people from other countries, to get to discover musicians from different countries. That has been tainted entirely by the politics of the contest this year. So it's very hard to situate what's happening this year in the more positive forms of politics that we've seen at the contest in the past.
Right, and I think that now the link is fixed with Charlie Sohn. Can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Tell us where you are right now. It looks like you're in the media room, the media center.
Yeah. So I'm in the media center in Malmö, in this kind of crazy version of Eurovision that is happening amidst, a lot of division and discord. And I think, as some of the other guests have said, it's kind of an interesting contrast to years past. I mean, I think Eurovision has always been political, but, if you think about Ukraine, the Ukraine-UK hosted version last year, the politics were of the sort that unite the Eurovision Coalition. And right now we're seeing a political issue that really seems to have people very much divided down the middle.
Yeah, we'll talk about that political mission in a moment. But as you say, it's always been political. Just so that the average viewer understands, there are actually two Eurovision Song Contests. On the night, on Saturday, there's going to be the song part, where everybody performs. And then, when everyone's done, there's the contest part.
Former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. L'ancienne République Yougoslave de
Greece should do well here.
8 points.
The contests, there you see, the slogan is united through music. But as you can see, at this point, there's the voting. And the voting part, what do you see traditionally? For instance, Charlie Sohn, you see Germany votes a lot for Turkey, and Turkey votes a lot for Germany because they have big expatriate communities. The Eastern Bloc countries vote for or against their neighbors, depending on how things are going politically. It's always political.
Yeah, and I mean, that sort of does bring up the issue of like what we mean when we talk about politics at Eurovision, because there's an extent to which, that's a very sort of like highly Eurovision fans love to debate whether votes are given out to countries based on politics or based on language affinity or cultural affinity, right? So it might not necessarily be a country voting for their neighbor because of some sort of political or cultural.
Okay, so Charlie, let's put this straight. Yeah. Does France never win because everybody hates us or because we stink?
Well, listen, I have to say, France, you only have to go back to Barbara Pravi, right? So, and this was the thing with the UK as well, right? Everyone hated them until Sam Ryder placed second. So I think sometimes we do, as far as the voting at Eurovision, I think we overrate this idea that like the music or putting effort into your act, doesn't matter, and people are just going to get the results that they get, right? But I think that you're absolutely right that Azerbaijan and Armenia are probably not going to be exchanging a lot of points, for instance.
All right. Again, it's unity through music, the theme. Crowds outside the venue this Thursday showing there's plenty of division over the presence of four-time winners Israel. The war in Gaza sparking calls for a boycott. It even wound up on the Twitter timeline of the French far-right lawmaker Mathilde Panot. She's among lawmakers from across the continent who are issuing a call over social media to bar Israel from the contest. Dave Keating, your thoughts on this year? Were you expecting this? The Israel-Gaza would would feature in this way?
I knew it would feature. Obviously, it was going to be controversial if Israel chose to enter this year despite being at war, and if the EBU allowed them to participate. However, I have been actually very surprised by the ferocity of the resistance. These calls to boycott Eurovision, I mean, I know a lot of people who are hardcore Eurovision fans and won't even watch it this year. This call to boycott has proven to be much more popular than I was expecting. And the protests in Malmo are much bigger than I was expecting. So we had this massive protest today ahead of tonight's semifinal, in which it will be determined whether Israel is going on to the final on Saturday night. Greta Thunberg, one of the world's most famous Swedes, was at that protest today. The security presence is incredible there. I'm sure Charlie and Dean could tell you more about that. I mean, I've heard it looks like a military camp over there because the security needs to protect the Israeli entry and to protect from any possible attacks of the contest itself have been deemed by Sweden to be very, very high. They've set the terror alert at the highest level. So I was expecting this would be controversial. I was not expecting that this would turn into what it has turned into.
Dean Vuletic, do you share that surprise?
Well, not really here on the ground. It's actually, I find, quite peaceful. It certainly has been in the past couple of days. Security is high, but when I think of previous Eurovisions, let's say in Baku in 2012, the venue in Baku was being protected by ships of the Azerbaijan Navy that were stationed in the Caspian Sea. So this is a very different situation here. Once again, security is high, but you can walk around the city freely. I observed the protest this afternoon. It was a very big protest, but it was a peaceful protest. So,
but
yes.
do you share Dave's surprise about the level of division among Eurovision fans?
Not really, because I think we've partly been here before. In 2019, when there were also calls to boycott Eurovision when it was being staged in Israel, in Tel Aviv. No country boycotted Eurovision that year. No country has boycotted Eurovision this year. And in 2019, Tel Aviv was actually targeted by rocket attacks coming from Gaza just weeks before the war. That was the closest that Eurovision had ever come to war. So I think this is continuing that activism that was developed in 2019.
Zoe, those left-wing lawmakers saying we kicked Russia out because after they invaded Ukraine, it's a double standard if we don't bar Israel this year. It's not flying. There's more division, though, this time over that. It's not like it was in 2022.
No, it's very different. And I think the key difference is that this year, while there's a very strong swell of support from fans to exclude Israel, and fans are perfectly aware of the problematic nature of allowing Israel to participate while they conduct very plausible war crimes against Palestinians. The difference is that when Russia invaded Ukraine, the elite mood was much more on the side of Ukraine. So what we're seeing this year is fans protesting because the EBU and the national broadcasters are refusing to. So Russia was excluded because broadcasters, including the ones in Sweden and Finland and the Netherlands, all demanded that Russia be excluded or they would withdraw, and they have refused to do that this year. So that's why we're seeing this level of necessary protest from fans, because the broadcasters have refused to do anything.
Dean Vuletic, Charlie Zone, excuse me, necessary protest, you agree with that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting, particularly comparing it to, let's say last year and Russia is, both Russia and Ukraine were in the Eurovision Coalition, right? So, you had Ukraine's voice on stage, and with Palestinians, their voice is not going to be on stage this evening, right? So, there is kind of a major difference in messaging, and there was in Iceland almost nominated a Palestinian artist to represent them. He did not ultimately go through, but it's not like Palestinians can send an artist of their own. And so I think I would agree that the protests add a necessary voice to sort of the what's being presented on stage.
Dean Vuletic, you agree?
Well, I actually think it's naive to expect the European Broadcasting Union and the national broadcasters that are members of the EBU to boycott Israel, because I don't think they have the political mandate to do so. The European Broadcasting Union is a non-political organization. It doesn't have political standards for membership, and it has only excluded countries in the past in a broader context of international sanctions. The first one being Yugoslavia, when it was targeted by international sanctions, which were adopted by the United Nations in 1992 due to Yugoslavia's roles in the wars in Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. Russia, most recently, after its invasion of Ukraine in 2022, its exclusion from Eurovision and from the European Broadcasting Union occurred also in a context of international and especially European sanctions. So the European Broadcasting Union really can only act against the country in this broader context of international action. The national broadcasting organizations as well, they don't set the foreign policies of their countries. No country participating in Eurovision has so far cut off diplomatic relations with Israel or adopted its own sanctions against Israel, which means that their national broadcasting organizations also do not have the power to do so.
Point taken, Zoe J.
I think that is precisely why fans are protesting. It's the fact that there is no elite mood among the broadcasters or among governments for this kind of action, because most European states have historically been very firmly supportive of Israel. But what fans are experiencing in real time is witnessing a level of violence that we have not seen in a very long time, and watching one of the state perpetrating that violence perform on stage and carry on as if it's normal. And so for fans, that's a really difficult situation, because the hypocrisy of the really positive sort of supporting of a political stance last year, when Eurovision was very firmly supportive of Ukraine's win the year before, and of the UK hosting on behalf of Ukraine, and that sort of positive politics contrasts with, especially because of the use of the same slogan, United by Music. Last year we had this really positive, affective, United by Music meant something to people last year, and this year what we are seeing is a total disunity of that music, because the state that the EBU is expecting everyone to be united with is perpetrating what is plausibly, as according to the International Court of Justice, a genocide.
Yeah, and yet we're seeing, and I'll put it to you, Dave Keating, as we heard Dean Vuletic at the outset of this conversation talk about the fact that songs with a message are tipped to do well on Saturday. So people want, I guess, can we draw a conclusion? People want more of a political message. They just don't agree on what that message is.
I think that's the tricky part, right? I mean, this ban on political content in the contest has always been a difficult line for the EBU to thread, because they all of a sudden become the arbiters of what is a political lyric and what is a non-political lyric. It's not a task that the EBU relishes, and I agree with both Dean and Zoe that the EBU's hand was kind of forced here in both instances. Very clearly in 2022, the EBU EU did not want to ban Russia. Immediately after the invasion, they came out with a response, with a statement. It was 2 months before the 2022 contest, and they said, nothing's changing, Russia is still in the contest. Within 24 hours, they had flipped, and that's because the broadcasters that were just mentioned threatened to pull out if they didn't. That didn't happen this time. That is the central difference. And what that has to do is elite opinion, government opinion. That's what's different about this year and 2022. That, like was just said, no government has sanctioned Israel that's participating in Eurovision. I think it should be mentioned also on Charlie's point, there is kind of this mistaken belief that Israel has some kind of exception for participating in Eurovision despite not being in Europe. It actually has every right to do so because the EBU's members are actually in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Arab countries could participate in Eurovision if they wanted to. They have in the past. Morocco participated in 1980, but that was in a year that Israel wasn't participating because it was busy with a war at that time. And the issue is that the Arab countries don't want to participate in a contest that has Israel in it because that would be recognizing Israel's existence. So while there can't be a Palestinian entry, there could be Arab entries, there could be several Arab entries. The Arab governments choose not to do so, and they have chosen not to do so for the past several decades.
Israel's contestant this year is Israeli-born, but grew up in part in Moscow with a Ukrainian-born mother. She was asked if the protest fazed her.
I have the best security team to take care of me and the entire delegation, and it's up to the people what to do. They have the right to speak their voice, but I'm focusing on my part, which is giving the best performance and on the good vibes, the good people.
So Charlie Stone, when she's performing, will people be listening to Eden Golan, or will they just see Israel is up on stage?
I mean, the show features a flag parade. You know, it's very hard to watch the intro videos, which Eurovision calls postcards, to see the flag parade and not see artists as representing the countries that they do. And I think that this is where, I Dean's point that, on the international sanctions, the EBU doesn't even go that far. If Dean was running the EBU, that would be a fine justification. Their claim is that these people aren't representing countries at all. They're representing national public broadcasters, and therefore Khan is a better public broadcaster than Russia's public broadcaster was. So I think the main problem with all of this is that Dave is entirely right that they were backed into these decisions because of their coalition. But, they had a year after, they were backed into the Russia decision to articulate a clear rubric and a clear principle. And they would prefer to kind of not, which I think is what gets them into trouble.
Gets them into trouble, but is there another way, Charlie?
I mean, I think honestly, if again, I'm not quite nominating Dean for Martin Osterdahl's job, but I would vote for him. No, but I think looking to another international body, like Dean brought up the case of Yugoslavia, right? This happened directly after UN sanctions, right? That Yugoslavia, under Slobodan Milosevic, was kicked out of the competition. Now, there is the International Criminal Court case. They could look to that. The UN is a little bit of a difficult case with Israel because of, U.S. protection in terms of vetoing resolutions. But they could say, whatever percentage of our membership's governments need to have introduced sanctions or something like that. The problem is that they aren't articulating any principles. And the thing is, it might be naive to assign principles to them, but this is how Eurovision messages itself. It claims that it was founded, in the aftermath of World War II to unite Europe. It has kind of in sort of affinity or association with these other post-war institutions like the UN or the EC, or aka the EU. So if they're not going to be that, and they are just going to be American Idol or frankly, the Olympics or FIFA, they need to change their messaging.
The public perception of what the Eurovision Song Contest is, Dave Keating, is different from reality, just as was mentioned there by Charlie. Like a lot of people think the Olympics are part of the UN. They don't realize it's a private body that makes a lot of money.
Sorry to interrupt, Francois. The audio cut out, so I didn't get your question.
My question's not finished, so I'll go for it now. People who aren't watching, people who don't follow the Eurovision Song Contest closely, might think it's an EU event like Erasmus is, for instance. They don't understand that it's something based out of non-EU member Switzerland. You're not connected. Okay, I'll put it to you, Dean Vuletic. Do people understand what the Eurovision Song Contest is?
I think you're very correct in pointing out this mistake that people often make in associating Eurovision directly with the European Union. And this is not true. The European Broadcasting Union has always been independent of other European organizations. It actually wasn't set up, Eurovision wasn't set up to promote European integration as an early tool of European integration. It started off as a technological experiment because the members of the European Broadcasting Union wanted to see if they could broadcast simultaneously a live show across Europe to test the nascent technology of television. It was just a technological experiment that happened to last a long time. And it wasn't always for sure that Eurovision would continue. There was a crisis in the contest in the late 1960s and 1970s when the European Broadcasting Union was wondering about the contest's popularity, its fashionability, its cost. And the contest came close to being scrapped. So nothing should be taken for granted in post-war European history, neither Eurovision nor European integration.
Gosh, we've talked to Zoe J about all the politics here, and I guess I come back to the original question when I asked earlier, what's the Eurovision Song Contest about? After we've gone around the table a few times, what is it about? Is it about purveying important symbols, getting this European unity, or not, when you have countries like Azerbaijan and Australia, which are not members of the European Union or not even in Europe?
First and foremost, I think it is about whatever people want it to be. And so that puts us in a position where if the EBU is going to refuse to acknowledge the politics that permeate the contest by insisting that it's non-political when it clearly is, that puts us as audiences, people who have the power to switch off, into a position where we are the ones who have to decide what values we stand for. The contest presents itself as building on those kind of post-war European unity narratives, even though it sort of historically was not the original purpose of the thing. They discovered that that was a useful branding strategy and they latched onto it very quickly. So if they promote these values of peace and musical harmony and love, then they have to evaluate what kind of values they are allowing on their stage. And at the moment, the performers they are allowing to participate do not reflect the values that they claim to promote. So that puts fans in a position where they have to decide whether that's something they want to be involved with or not.
Well, we're expecting to see perhaps some shows of solidarity with the civilians in Gaza. We had one singer, a Swedish singer, Eric Sada, who I saw during rehearsals, who had was wearing a pro-Palestinian scarf, but speaking up as a price for artists. Russia's representative to the 2021 Eurovision Song Contest, Manizha, has been sidelined since she spoke out against the invasion of Ukraine. Still, she's come out with a new single and spoken with the Associated Press from an undisclosed location in Russia.
It's like almost impossible to make a single, even to do a music video. People are afraid to work with me, here, because they're afraid to have consequences problems after that. I understand that. Everyone wants to protect their lives and their families. Nobody wants to be in prison,
Let me turn to the historian here. Dean Vuletic, are today's generation more willing or less willing to defend a cause, speak out than before when it's artists?
Well, I chose to study the history of Eurovision because I believe that Eurovision has always reflected political and social change in Europe. So I think that this is a trend that has gone on throughout the contest. In the early years of the contest, we saw a lot of artists dealing with women's rights, with sexual liberation. Then in the 1970s, the issues that were fashionable were the peace movement and green issues. And, in recent years, we've seen the rights of sexual minorities take the stage very prominently. So I think that artists engaging with political and social issues is really nothing new in Eurovision, and I think that's what makes the contest so fascinating and so attractive to such a large audience. As was mentioned earlier, why would you watch Eurovision if it didn't have this aspect? Then you may as well watch all of the other televised song contests that there are, which are just dishing out the same innocuous pop music.
Yeah, and Charlie Sonner, does it wax and wane, this level of political engagement according to the year?
Yeah, I think it does, and I think it has to do with what's going on in the broader world. So this is a contest that in 1956 started. Germany sent Walter Andreas Schwarz, who basically had a song about how Germany was not dealing with the legacy of the Nazis properly, right? It was a festival that was started in a time where there was a lot of division. I do think that during particularly like the 80s and 90s, we got to a point where, with the exception of the integration of the Eastern European states, the mid to late 90s, for instance, was a very apolitical time in Eurovision. But it had to do with the fact that, we were at this time of the end of history, like Fukuyama's idea, right? There weren't these kind of big fundamental debates about within the European coalition going on. And, I think that you can really see basically from, the 2010s on, as you see, the rise of right-wing authoritarianism in Europe, you're starting to see these underlying values that the EBU and Eurovision list in their handbook, basic rights of democracy, of freedom, of, diversity. These are now up for debate again. So there's no way that those debates are not going to play themselves out on the Eurovision stage.
Those are live images, by the way, that we're watching. We saw one person one protester being escorted away. Others seem to be seemingly who are being shuttled away in a more peaceful manner. From near the entrance there, not too far from where you are, Charlie. The Eurovision Song Contest, a mirror of something broader when it comes to music and society. Dave Keating, you've followed it for years. Is that why you're interested in it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm American by background, so I had actually never heard of it when I moved to Europe in 2007. Kind of became a little obsessed after that. But I think that's absolutely right. What Dean and Charlie were saying is that it kind of follows the political zeitgeist, and we really saw a low ebb in the 1990s, I think both for political messaging, but also, frankly, for the quality of the music. And the contest just fundamentally transformed in 2000. They got rid of the language restriction, which had been pushed by France, so countries could suddenly sing in any language they wanted to, which usually meant English. Before that, they were forced to sing in their own language. They no longer had to sing with a live orchestra. So the contest since 2000 has become this major commercially successful event. They had up to 200 million viewers, which actually is more people than watch the Super Bowl, the Oscars, and the Grammys combined. So what kind of has me so interested in this as a journalist who covers European politics is that this is Europe's biggest cultural export. And a lot of Europeans don't know it. A lot of them don't fully appreciate what a big deal this is. This is the biggest thing they do together as a continent in the cultural sphere. In many ways, it's the only thing they do together, but it is hugely successful. And now there are knockoffs being launched all over the world, in America, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. It's something Europeans can be quite proud of, actually.
Zoe J., you agree?
I think it has been something that Europeans can be very proud of, and Australians as well. But it's very difficult to retain any kind of sense of pride over an event that provides a platform for state violence. It's not only Israel that's doing that, it's Azerbaijan, and it historically was Russia as well. So there's a very fine line between being proud of the event and participating in using it to provide a stage for violence.
But we heard Dean Vuletic earlier talking about how causes have been brought forth in the past. Speaking out, though, can be bad for business when you're an artist, except if you're Taylor Swift, perhaps. What do you do, though, when one of your concert tours generates revenues to rival the GDP of small countries? Taylor Swift, who, by the way, is landed in Paris as part of her Eras tour. In 2020, she endorsed Joe Biden for president. Should she do the same this time? Our own Peter O'Brien asked fans waiting outside the concert hall in the French capital.
Taylor's great in the sense because she just inspires people to really get out and vote, which is also important.
She has the power to influence a lot of people. She has not really came out either way on which side she's with, I don't believe. But yes, I think she has the power to influence a lot.
Era where women's rights are being challenged in the United States, the Swiftie army that I see everywhere, very, very powerful. I think women are very underrepresented in the vote, but they always show up, and I think she could get the vote out for sure and move it a certain way.
Yeah, I think she has a really big platform, and a lot of people would be influenced by what she has to say and her beliefs and values.
Dean Vuletic, we've seen with K-pop as well that they've moved the needle politically. Eurovision Song Contest, are there artists who can move the needle?
Absolutely. Just think of Conchita Wurst, the bearded drag queen who won for Austria in 2014. She also used her performance in Eurovision to criticize the anti-gay laws that were adopted by the government of Vladimir Putin in Russia. So, yes, Eurovision stars really can change attitudes.
It can change attitudes. Your thoughts on the power of stars today as opposed to the past?
The power of stars today as opposed to the past. Well, I think stars are even more powerful these days, considering all of the communication channels that there are to interact with the stars themselves and the content they produce. So really, they are big players in terms of shaping public opinion. And I think we also see that in Eurovision, and the fact that Eurovision artists also very consciously used Eurovision as a platform to express social and political messages to such a huge audience, 160 million viewers in recent years.
Charlie Stone, that mirrors what we've seen in recent years in sports like soccer and basketball, where despite clubs trying to remain politically neutral, the athletes speak out more than in the past.
Yeah, that's 100% true. And I think that, that's the amazing thing about Eurovision, is that it shares that kind of mass market appeal of something like the Olympics in a world where we're getting more and more fragmented and everybody's, just, watching their own narrow feed. As has been said, Eurovision appeals to a wide audience, but it's different than sports in that, it's art, it's music. So it lends itself even more naturally to an artist speaking out, because the reason we like the artists we do is not because they can run, a track faster than anyone. We like them because their way of seeing the world is something that we respond to. And so politics is inherent in that.
Zoe J, a musician has more power in that way than an athlete or perhaps some other kind of artist?
I think that's true in the sense that music is inherently emotional, so you can use music to feel certain ways, but if the resistance is sort of refusing to participate in an event, the dynamic is the same. And you can see very successful forms of artists and sporting stars resisting political contexts. For example, the Lord refused to perform in Israel, and the formerly Dixie Chicks spoke out against the Iraq War. But there's also very famous sporting icons like Colin Kaepernick refusing to stand for the American national anthem in light of police brutality in the US, and previously, for example, Jesse Owens, the American athlete who refused to take his medal at the Olympics in Nazi Germany.
Of course, it works both ways, Dean Vuletic. Music can also be for propaganda.
Music can also be for propaganda, and Eurovision has also had a relationship with dictatorships throughout its history. When we speak of the non-political standards for membership in the European Broadcasting Union, this meant in the early decades of the Cold War that Spain and Portugal were members when they were under right-wing dictatorship. Communist Party-led Yugoslavia was also a member, even though it didn't have media freedoms to the extent that Western liberal democracies
And
had.
did that propaganda ever win? Was there songs that were clearly purveying a authoritarian message that won?
Well, can an innocuous pop song be propaganda? It can, because it can portray even a dictatorship as modern and fashionable and fun. And this happened with Spain in 1968 when Maciel won with the song La La La. It sounds like an innocuous pop song, and it was, but it took Eurovision to Madrid the year after, and the government, the dictatorship of Francisco Franco, could use the staging of Eurovision to whitewash its international image. Azerbaijan in 2012, a very similar example.
Charlie Zon, is Eurovision a battleground for culture wars?
I think, again, I think it kind of has to be, you know, and I think Dean bringing up La 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 is a perfect example, because even that innocuous pop song, you know, initially was in Catalan, and the artist was swapped out because, you know, the image that Franco's government wanted of Spain was one of a sort of unified nationalist idea of Spain and the Spanish language. So it gets really hard to envision a festival where someone is singing words representing a country that is truly apolitical. Like, I don't even know what that would mean.
All right, well, this Thursday, by the way, happens to be Europe Day, where the bloc celebrates putting centuries of war in its past. This year, it falls the same week as the bicentennial of the first public performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which famously sets to music German poet Friedrich Schiller's Ode to Joy. There you see a children's choir, Dave Keating, performing earlier this week outside of the EU headquarters. Dave, you think of Ode to Joy and celebrating its bicentennial this week, the same week as the Eurovision Song Contest. Talk about a catchy tune. But your thoughts, again, on what you heard Dean say in light of this milestone this week.
Well, it's funny you bring up Ode to Joy, because actually that itself has been hugely controversial over whether that is really the EU anthem, because actually both the flag and the anthem were supposed to be officially designated in the Constitution, but after French voters and Dutch voters rejected that Constitution, that stuff was taken out because it sounded too much like a nation, like a super state. And so while you see at events like today, at Europe Day, we have this singing of Ode to Joy, it is not official. It is just kind of done by practice. And that's because of the big fight that exists between EU member states about whether they want to have ever closer union or whether they just want a free trade zone with loose association. So actually that example in itself shows the kind of division that can befall these types of projects that are trying to bring Europe together. It remains controversial in much the same way that we see with the Eurovision Song Contest.
All right, so there's controversy ahead. There's also a lot of singing ahead and glam. We'll see what happens with the semifinal tonight, Dave, and then the finals on Saturday.